My name is Rachel Davenport. I was in the Delet MAT program in cohort 12. And my inquiry project, I just want to start off by saying, ended up changing as much as it changed me. My internship this past year was at Stryer Hebrew Academy, along with Sari, in Sharon in the 3rd grade class. The class was a small and very energetic group of boys. Now, what do I mean by energetic? You get a little sense of that there. But on a daily basis, while teachers were trying to teach, these students tapped and hit their desks with their hands and pencils. They hummed or whistled or even sang during class. They tapped or kicked their feet noisily on the floor against their desks. They fiddled with small toys or silly putty at their desks, and they regularly turned and talked to one another in the middle of class. They were much more interested in focusing their attention on one another and on entertaining each other by making faces or jokes during learning time. And I hasten to say that all of this, that this was true for all of the teachers, not just for me as the intern. We tried a number of strategies to help the boys focus. We used OT seat cushions to help them move around a little. We instituted a reward system with stickers. We used fidget tools. We let them take breaks from the classroom if they seemed to need it, water breaks or exercise breaks, or sometimes just a chance to be in another room. And all of these things worked until they didn't. And when they didn't, the students were unable to be productive participants in class. So what do I mean by productive participant? A productive participant is a student who's accomplishing the task at hand in a way that's not disruptive to the community. So a student who's accomplishing the assigned task but whose whistling is distracting somebody else, for example, would not meet the criteria for a productive participant. But nor would a student who's quietly coloring but not distracting anybody else, who's not accomplishing the assigned task. So my initial inquiry question was, how can I enable and empower students to be productive participants in class? I had initially planned to research the whole class, but to make things a little more manageable, I decided to focus on one student in particular, whom I will be calling Erez. Erez was one of the thumpiest, whistlingest, outingest kids in the class. I figured if I could help him focus, it would benefit the whole class. But before I could figure out how to enable and empower and enable Erez to be a productive participant, I had to gather some data on him to help me get to know him better. So I gathered a lot of different data, and I had no idea what to do with it at first. And I decided to start by looking at my field notes and journal entries. I transferred my notes onto a chart indicating the time of day that I was recording, the off-task or distracting behavior that Erez displayed, my strategy to try to help him refocus, and then whether or not the strategy was effective. My initial analysis focused on what teacher strategies worked and didn't work. But then I wasn't really sure where to go with that. It just actually didn't end up feeling very helpful. So I decided to look at some other data. I had video. This is a screenshot of a video of a class discussion that we had about the book Charlotte's Web, which we were reading at the time. And we were seated in a circle on the rug rather than in their seats at the desks. So I watched the video several times and created a chart about what I saw. So at my first viewing, I charted every move that Erez made, where he looked, what he did with his hands, and what was he doing with the book, etc. At my next viewing, I charted what was I doing? What were my teacher moves? How did I interact with him? How did I interact with other students that were simultaneous to Erez's movements? And finally, I charted what the other students were doing at the same time. What I discovered was that Erez was literally moving the entire time I recorded. He was always moving. Sometimes it was small movements, putting his hands on his face. Sometimes it was bigger movements, splaying himself across the circle. But he was always moving the entire time. But then I didn't know what to do with these data either. So I decided it was time to learn from people more knowledgeable than I. I pulled out a book that I had received many years ago from Leandra Elion by Mel Levine. Mel Levine was a learning expert and a doctor, and the book was Mind at a Time. Levine's general premise in this book is that the more teachers know about neurodevelopment, which is the development of neurological pathways in the brain, or more simply how each brain works, the better able they'll be to address children's particular learning needs in the appropriate ways. I began wondering if there might be something about Erez's neurodevelopment that was making being a student in the ways that we expected of him truly impossible. Was what we were doing to try to help him actually making it harder for him to function as a thinking, participating member of the classroom? Levine's book led me to this insight. Recognizing the causes of a student's behavior could help me explore and attempt more effective strategies and supports for him. So I came up with a couple of new questions. My first question was, how can I discern how my student's neurodevelopment might be affecting his ability to be a productive learner? Interesting question. My second question was, how can I find and introduce strategies that will help him focus, or at least be less distracting in class? And then I looked at that second question again, or at least be less distracting. And I had a really disconcerting realization. My research was focusing on all the ways that Erez's behavior was driving me bananas in class, and not enough about his strengths. So my first finding was, it can be challenging for a teacher to be an objective observer. My own learning and processing issues were influencing the ways that I was perceiving Erez's behavior. I knew rationally that he was doing what he was doing because something else was going on for him, and he was showing me that his needs were not being met. But it was really hard to separate my own sensory overload from his need for a sensory diet. Whenever he whistled, the noise threw me off my game, and when he made silly faces, it distracted me, and when he thumped on the table or stretched his silly putty or moved his head back and forth, I couldn't stay on track. So all of this influenced the way that I was collecting my data and how I had begun my research. I had focused on all of these behaviors. Ostensibly, it had been to help him as a learner, but I was starting to see that it was often to help me as a teacher. So what I learned is that I really need to be very conscientious about noticing my own biases or issues when I'm observing a student. As I thought more about this and about my readings in Levine's book, I decided that the best way to help this student succeed as a learner would be to focus on his neurodevelopmental strengths and use them to develop learning strategies, rather than try to channel them into other behaviors. So I made a list of Erez's strengths, and he had a lot of them. But what really stood out for me about him was that Erez was an active, athletic kid who was happiest when he was moving. Focusing on that strength and joy of his would likely have helped me find effective systems and strategies to help him be a productive participant in class. So I decided to use these observations to inform my research and focus on his active behaviors. I started to explore strategies, decided to explore strategies suggested for students who exhibit similar behaviors. So it was time to do some more reading. So in addition to Levine's book, I explored How the Special Needs Brain Learns by David Sousa, Driven to Distraction by Ned Hallowell and John Brady, and Inclusion Strategies That Work, Research-Based Methods for the Classroom by Toby Carton. All of these resources talked about how physically active students need a sensory diet. A sensory diet is sort of ways for their bodies to interact physically with the world through exercise or things to touch or hold, or other ways to just input sensory information into their bodies. So based on my data and analysis and all the readings I did, I came to my second finding. Erez was a student who needed a consistent sensory diet, and it was not helpful to him to focus on trying to teach him to sit still. He needed strategies to help him channel his natural energy. So this finding led me to a more refined question for my inquiry project. Oops, excuse me, wait a minute. How can I reach and teach a physically active student like Erez? So it occurred to me that if I sought out strategies for Erez using theories of universal design for learning, UDL, it's more than likely that whatever strategies I came up with for Erez would also help other students in this very active class. So for example, some of the strategies I think I would use if I had a do-over for that Charlotte's Web discussion, I would give each student a piece of chewing gum. Gum chewing is a simple but profound way to allow for constant sensory input for students, and it also prevents whistling. Toss a beanbag to whomever is speaking. It's good incentive for students to speak because then they get to hold the beanbag and squeeze it and get sensory input during the discussion. And bonus, it also guides the other students' eyes to whomever is speaking. Have the students alternate between standing and sitting, or crossing one leg over and then the other leg over, and you could do that between speakers or at a time basis. Keep the discussion limited to a shorter period of time. And if the discussion does need to be longer, to include time for brain gym, which is a way to increase plasticity across brain hemispheres by using the body. You move like from right to left or left to right, then it helps the brain, or just exercise, or even just water breaks. And the last idea that I came up with was to give them some tactile input, so give each child something small to touch during the discussion. So in this case, I thought it might be interesting to give each student a piece of yarn and have them make it into a web on the floor as we were talking about Charlotte's Web. So all of these concrete ideas helped me realize that I had started my inquiry project with a goal that was way too lofty. Basically, how can I fix this class? And the more I thought about it, I came to a different place. So I'm ending my inquiry project with what I think is a more realistic goal. Be mindful of the ways I'm observing my students and look for their strengths. And then use them to build systems and strategies to help them in class. This I can do, and I'm looking forward to doing it in the classroom.